Hi, so this is the fifth lecture of our deep learning course, and this one will be about losses, optimization, so mostly stochastic gradient descent, weight initialization, and also we'll say a little bit about L1 and L2 regularization. So we start with cross entropy. So what we have seen so far for loss to train models was the mean squared error loss that we took from the regression problem where it makes sense. We can justify this with a noise model, a Gaussian noise model, which pushes the proper model to be centered in a L2 sense on the data points. And we use this loss even for classification. So we introduce the notion of one-hot vectors, which basically convert a class index into a vector with -1s everywhere and +1 on the class. And using this loss in this case pushes the model to produce -1s to produce as many classes as there are, as many scores as there are classes, sorry, and to tend to produce -1s for score for the incorrect classes and +1 for score for the correct class. So first, intellectually it's unsatisfying because the notion of Gaussian noise here makes absolutely no sense. And also, from a very practical perspective, what is extremely unpleasant here is that imagine that your model is predicting a very high value, for instance, on the correct class, even though it's desirable, because it means the model is super confident of its prediction and it's a correct one. You would not be happy because the loss would not be happy because it would penalize being on the right side or being on the wrong side as much. So, for instance, if you are using +1 as the target score for the correct class, if your model predicts +11 or -9, you end up being 10 points away from the target value. And the mean square error loss is as bad. It's you pay a cost of 100 in the loss. Okay, so we will come back to this, but we can summarize this by saying that this loss penalizes being too strongly on the right side as much as it penalizes being too strongly on the wrong side, which is really not what you want. So in practice for classification, what is mostly the most used criterion is the cross entropy. So to explain, to justify this loss, let's come back to the logistic regression and let's extend it to the multi-class setup. So here we want to predict the class of input on X, and we cast it as our predictor being a bunch of functionals, one per class, that each is going to produce one real value. And we use the following generative model, which is that the probability that a data point is of a certain class, given the X and the parameter of the functionals, is going to be proportional to exponential of the response of the function of the proper class, so of the class Y, sorry. So the probability for X to be of class Y is equal to, is proportional to exponential Fy xw, which means that given that we have this number of classes, we know the value of z, which is the sum of the others exponential fk. Okay. So under this model, we can use Bayes' law once more and look at the probability for a certain value for the parameters of the functional. So what is the probability for the parameters of the set of functionals to be small w given the data set is small d? We use Bayes' formula once more. This quantity does not depend on w, so we can put it in a constant. And we just use the log of the product is the sum of the log. And then we use the independence of the data points, the x and y n, and in the end we end up with the probability of a certain set of the density of a certain set of parameters given the data is the sum of the log of the label of each data point plus the log of the prior distribution over the parameters minus a constant that does not depend on the parameters. And then we put our expression for the probability of a label given, probability of the class given the signal, and we get this quantity. Okay, so we get finally that it would make sense to have a loss that maximizes this thing. which depend on the output, and then we have a prior which depend on the parameters. Now let's ignore the penalty on the parameters for a second. In the end, it makes sense to minimize this quantity. So in the previous slide, we want to maximize this stuff. So now we minimize minus this average quantity. So now let's introduce what is the cross entropy. So if you give me two distributions P and Q over a finite set, 1 to C, the cross entropy P of P and Q is minus the sum of probability under P log of probability under Q of K. So if P equal Q, then this is the standard entropy of P. Otherwise, it's a different quantity. And what is interesting is that now we can reinterpret this quantity by saying this is actually the cross entropy between the Dirac distribution on the right class and our estimate for the set of parameters. So now let's put all this together. Formally, it's quite simple. This quantity is, by definition of this is under our model the log of the probability of y being equal to yn given x equal xn. And this can be rewritten as we sum over all the k's and we put a Dirac in front that kills everybody but the proper one. So now instead of having probability of y equal yn, we have the sum for all the k's, but everybody dies except the correct one. And this is precisely the cross entropy between the Dirac over yn and the probability or model of probability given the response of functionals. So we can interpret this as the average of the cross entropy between the deterministic true posterior delta yn and the estimated PW, the estimated posterior given x. And it makes perfect sense to want to align the two, and we see it makes perfect sense in a maximum likelihood interpretation. So in the end, it's what we are going to use for now. And it's actually what torch.nn.cross-entropy-loss implements. It's exactly this. So now, if I create a tensor of two vectors of a tensor of dimension 2, which is two 1D vectors of dimension 3, that can be interpreted as or scores over 3 classes for 2 samples. And now we say that the true labels are 0 and 1, so it should be, we want to have a high score for this guy in the first sample and a high score for this guy in the second sample. If we say criterion equal torch and cross entropy loss, so now we define this criterion and we compute according to this criterion the discrepancy between this F, which is this bunch of scores, on the target, we get 2.5141, which is exactly this quantity. So it's exactly minus the average of the log of, and this is the posterior probability under our model of the right class, and this is the posterior probability on the first sample, and the posterior probability of the right class for the second sample. Okay, this -1 is this -1. Why? Because this class is 0, so we want for the first sample the probability of this class to be correct, and the probability of this class to be correct is exponential of this guy divided by the sum of the exponential of all these guys. And for the second sample, we want the probability of this guy to be high, and the probability of this guy is exponential this divided by the sum of this exponential of those guys. And if you compute this, you get exactly this. So if we put all this together, it makes perfect sense. We just want to have high scores over the right classes, and we cast the notion of right scores in a probabilistic manner by having this posterior distribution, which is exponential normalized, and cross entropy simply does this. Cross entropy simply pushes the scores to be higher so that the posterior distribution align with the true labels. Now a bit of quantitative meaning. So the range would be 0 if the samples were perfectly classified. So if by some reasons it's hard to get this with exponential, but if you had all these other scores going to 0 and you end up with a 1 in the right class, you would have log of 1 plus log of 1 plus log of 1 would be 0. In the worst case, if you answer a uniform distribution, so if all your scores are equal, you end up here with 1 over the number of class, so you end up with log 1 over the number of class. With the minus in front, you get the log of the number of class, and because you take the average, overall you get the log of the number of class. You can even get worse than this if for some reason your model is doing is more confident than uniform on incorrect. So if you put even more mass than uniform on the wrong responses, then you could get something up to infinity as a loss if you are very wrong. So now we can come back to our original motivation. So let's consider, for instance, a model with two outputs, so a two-class problem, a binary class. And let's say now the x-axis is the activation of the correct output unit, so we want x to be equal to 1. And the y is the axis of the incorrect unit, so we want the second unit to be equal to -1. So with the mean square error, here I plot the values, the coordinate of this square are the outputs of the two units of our model, the f1, f2, or the two output units of a complicated model. And what we see that indeed, when we respond +1 for x and -1 for y, the loss is close to 0, is 0 actually, if it's exactly -1 + 1. But as soon as we go away from this, the loss increases, even if we go in the right direction. So for instance, if we were there, we'd be quite happy because we would respond +4 on the right unit, the unit for the correct class, and -4 for the incorrect unit, the unit for the incorrect class. So that would be correct and super confident. But here the mean square error gives us a high score, a high loss in that case. If we look at the value of cross entropy, we are plenty happy because now the more we get away from this linear structure, the lesser the loss. So which means that when we are in this domain, even if you go on pushing, the loss will go down and down and down. So we are very happy with this. It's exactly what we are looking for our classification. Okay, so one technical detail is that there is another loss called NLL loss, which is simply the sum of the one minus the average of the output scores, the output activations for the proper labels. And if your model actually produces log probabilities, so if the output of your model can be interpreted directly as log probabilities and not as scores, which are unnormalized, which means that if the last layer, for instance, of your model is log softmax, which takes a bunch of values and pass them in this transformation, which is basically the transformation we introduced to interpret the scores in the previous slides. We said we are going to interpret the scores by saying that the posterior distribution is exactly this. So if the last layer of your network does this normalization and then you use this loss, it's exactly as, the loss will be exactly as if you did not have the last layer and you were using cross entropy. So cross entropy is basically the combination of the composition of this transformation and this loss. So this loss, NLL loss, just want to put high scores, just sum the scores of the right unit. For this to make sense, it has to also directly take into account the fact that you should not increase everybody. So which is the case if you have normalization before it. So if you have the log softmax, which is a very standard normalization, you combine it with this, you get exactly the entropy. So in practice, it means that if you actually make use of the output of your model as probabilities, so if you want your model to actually produce log probabilities, you should have this as the last layer, as a final module, and you should train it with this guy. If you just want to have, you don't care, and you don't want, you do not especially want to have normalized log probabilities, then you can simply train it with cross entropy, and it will be identical. One point, why do we call this a softmax? It's because it's a soft variant of the Boolean, the argmax Boolean label. So it's sort of at the limit, if the largest value in there is very large, far larger than the others, this would tend to zeros everywhere but on the right value. So for instance, we can take this example. Here I have on the first sample, my output scores are -10, -10, -10, -5. Second sample 3, 0, 0, 0, etc. But we see that indeed, here the max is the third, and we see that here the gap is very large. It completely crushes the others. You have a gap of 15 between the top and the second top. And we see that indeed it's almost Boolean. You have a 1 over the right one, and the others are completely crushed because the exponential has a very quickly decreasing tail. If you look at the second one, it's also quite close to Boolean, and then the third one is more ambiguous. So it's called softmax because indeed it's a soft version of a transformation that would put zeros everywhere except on the index of the highest value, which would be a 1. Now PyTorch provides, as all the other deep learning frameworks, a lot of criteria. We are mostly going to use those two guys, mean square error and cross entropy, but you have plenty of others like L1, which is really like the L1 penalties, the absolute value, and others like the variant of this guy, but in 2D when you deal with activation maps and multi-margin like SVM kind of loss. Okay. So now we come to a quite central algorithm, which is a stochastic gradient descent, which is a variation around the idea of gradient descent, and is basically the central algorithm we use to train large models. So far what we have seen as an optimization method to minimize our loss is what's so-called vanilla gradient descent, which is if we have a loss which is a function of the parameters, which is actually a sum over sample of loss per sample, which is a measure of discrepancy between the value our model produce and the expected value, or a quantity which allows us to assess the quality of the prediction. Given such a loss, we have proposed, we have justified actually an update rule of the form. We take the current value of our parameters and we subtract a fraction of the gradient of the loss with respect to the parameters. And it can be interpreted in many ways. The most standard one is that it corresponds to going down the slope, to always follow the steepest direction, the direction of the steepest descent. But actually, so even though it makes a lot of sense to do this, we justified this with an approximation of the loss locally and many other arguments. But in practice, there are a few points to notice. So the first one is that it's nice to do mathematics, but in practice, this costs a lot of computation. And actually, it costs all our computation. This is a key issue in deep learning. This is why you need GPUs and the clusters and weeks of training. It's because of the optimization of the model. So it's really a key issue. The second thing is that this loss is an empirical estimation of a hidden quantity. It's not a perfect value. We are not optimizing like the shape of a plane or some protein folding thing. We are just optimizing the model so that the empirical loss, which is a noisy quantity reflecting a true loss, gets down. So we already have noise in the system. And it maybe justifies that we can have some sort of approximate optimization that would do far better, because the price we pay in terms of loss is completely compensated by the speed up. And finally, maybe what is the most important, that since the loss is computed incrementally, when we go through this summation, and even if we have a lot of parallel computing, we never have enough computing to do this in one shot, because this is often of the orders of millions. When we do this summing, it's actually being done in time, sequentially, which means that when we reach a certain value of this small n in this sum, we already have computed all the previous ones. So in some way, there is something that we feel we could do. We could probably, when we reach a certain n, even far smaller than big N, we are in the middle of the sum. Maybe we can already improve the W we have by taking into account what we have done so far, instead of going on computing the gradient of this guy for a value which has not been updated for thousands of things. So imagine if this guy is 1,000,000, you would reach 10,000 and still would not have updated your Ws, even though you have already computed 10,000 losses that told you something about the current way that would be how you could optimize your parameter. And to make this very practical, very concrete, imagine that you have been cheated, and actually your 1,000,000 example training set is in reality the same 1,000 examples which have been repeated 1,000 times. Okay, imagine that you are provided a training set of 1,000,000 samples, on the structure you are not aware of is that it's the same set of 1000 which has been repeated 1000 times. Okay? In that case, when you compute the sum over all the samples of your loss, you could actually sum it over the first 1000, the first small big M, and do this k times. But since all those quantities now are equal, because we say that the samples are repeated by a group of M, so each group of M is the same, you can just multiply in front, which means that instead of paying a price of 1 million whatever, you would pay a price of 1000 whatever, and just do for free move k times more than eta. So instead of using a training rate of eta with this guy, you could use a training rate of k times eta with this guy, and you would do exactly the same. So of course this is quite an ideal for this slide, but more a completely pathological situation. But in practice, this is connected to what I was saying in the previous slides. You want to do an update all the time. You want to somehow you would like to do the best use of all the computations you have done at any moment. If I have already seen even 5 samples, it makes sense that I should do my best to improve my parameters based on what I have seen on those 5 samples, to do my best use of the 6 to come. So there is this notion that the more you wait to update your parameters, the more it's time wasted. You should really do it as often as you can. And it's basically the very notion of stochastic gradient descent. So the stochastic gradient descent, the purest form of it, is extreme and simply consists of updating the parameter Wt after every single sample. So instead of summing the gradient over all the samples and doing your update, now every time you see one sample, you update your weight according to the gradient over those guys. The problem that this does not benefit from the speed up of batch processing that we have seen. We saw that pushing the samples by batch through the GPUs and whatever processing unit we have is really crucial. We saw a speed up of up to 2 orders of magnitude. One experiment was a speed up of 80. So that leads us to what is a very standard recipe for deep learning, which is a mini-batch stochastic gradient descent, which consists of, basically, instead of looking at all your samples and doing your gradient step, you look at a small batch of them. Let's say it can be 10 or 100, depending with your memory and your problem, but it's the order of magnitude. It's between 3 and 100, say. You compute your gradient only on this small subset, and then you do a gradient step, and then you move to another batch of the same size. Okay. One key choice to make is how do you visit your sample. So here, this n of tb is what is the sample b of mini batch of the teeth mini batch. A standard recipe is that you are going to visit your whole set several times. It's called an epoch, and every time you are starting from the beginning of your set, you shuffle it, and then you go in order. So you visit them in this shuffled order. You visit all your samples. So it's kind of a sampling without replacement. You shuffle, but you never visit the same sample twice in one given epoch. An important point, so of course this is stochastic compared to the full standard gradient descent, because now you make your move, you are not assured that when you have visited all your samples with this rule, you have the position you are going to reach has anything to do with what you would have reached doing the vanilla gradient descent. But overall, the stochastic behavior of this procedure, which is, you can imagine there is no, in the extreme case, in the vanilla gradient, stochastic gradient descent, there is no average of any sort. Every time you see a sample, you do a little change of your parameters. The stochastic behavior of this procedure in practice often helps to evade local minima, so which is a very good property. So here I did a small experiment on a MNIST with a small network similar to the one we have seen before, and the x-axis stands for the number of samples we have seen during the optimization. The y-axis is the best train loss we have observed so far, so I take the best because to filter out the oscillation, because otherwise it's not as smooth. But overall it reflects exactly what is happening. And what we see is that so the top line, basically the lines are sorted with the mini batch size. So at the top we do standard gradient descent, which is we look at all the sample on one gradient step. Then we look at all the sample and then do gradient step. So basically, when we do the first step, we have seen all the training set, the NIST training set, which means 60,000 samples. So when we do the first step, we have seen the 60,000. Second step, we have seen 120,000, etc. So of course, there is so few steps, because when we have visited the samples, when we have seen 300,000 samples, we have done only 5 gradient steps. The loss is quite bad. Then the second line is the algorithm, the stochastic gradient descent with mini batches of size 10,000, which means we sum the gradients over 10,000 samples, then we move, we update the weight, the parameters, we look again at 10,000 and we repeat like this. So every time we have seen all these samples, we have done 6 steps of stochastic gradient descent. This line is when we see mini batch of size 1,000, light blue is 100, red is 10, and black is 1. So we see that the behavior of the minimization is basically the same whether we have batches of 110 or 1 samples, mini batches of 110 or 1 samples. Of course, the speed would not be the same. So here I just show the loss as a function of the number of samples we have seen, but there is a tremendous difference of speed between having mini batch of size 100 or mini batch of size 1. Okay, so now we come to the point where we can see more precisely, we can look more precisely at the limitation of the gradient descent. So we have seen already this a bit. We saw that you can be trapped in a local minimum and you can oscillate around a local minimum. If we come back to the fundamental idea behind the gradient descent or the stochastic gradient descent, it makes a strong assumption about the magnitude of the local curvature to fix the step size. So this, and also it makes an assumption about its isotropy. So it makes the assumption that in all directions the linear model reflects the same way how your loss is going to go down. So if we take a functional which actually follows this assumption, which is simply a symmetric paraboloid, so it's centered on 0 and it's a quadratic surface. If we look at the level lines, so this is seen from above, we are in a 2D space. If we look at the level lines, they look like that, and if we do gradient descent using the standard recipe on this step size, eta, this is what happens. So we move and we slow down because the gradient is getting close to 0, and in the end we end up in the global minimum. We are super happy. Now imagine that the function is different, it's not anymore symmetric, an anisotropic quadratic form, but something which has a greater different curvature in the two axes. If we do the gradient descent, this is what happens, of course, because the gradient is far stronger in this direction than in the other, so you quickly move to the minimum in the direction y, but because the curvature is far larger, is far wider along the x-axis, you go far slower because it's not as steep. So the gradient, basically, the gradient was stronger in this direction than the other, so you move like that. If we increase the step size to compensate for this, which makes sense, you could say, okay, I want to go to my minimum quickly, so I double my step size. If you double your step size by this, it looks fine, it's okay. But now if you go even further and you say, okay, I really want to go quickly to the minimum, and I want to compensate for the small gradient in the x-axis, in the x direction. If you push too much, this is what happens, because now you overshoot for the y direction, and you have to come back. So it's really what we saw in 1D. You are bouncing around in a valley. If you push even more your eta, this is what happens. And if you push even more, this is what may happen. You may actually diverge in one of the directions. So what we see here is very, very concerning, because it means that we have no way, by playing with the learning rate, to actually go fast enough in one direction while still converging in the other. So this is quite an issue. So now some optimization methods address the problem by looking at higher order moments, because of course if you were looking at the second order derivative, you would spot immediately that, okay, now I see in the second order that in one direction is less, there is more curvature than in the other, so you could compensate for this. So it would be like a Newton step of other method that look at the second order. The problem is that it's super expensive. So usually it's so expensive to use those methods in the context of deep learning because you have so many parameters that now if you look at the total time of computation, even if each iteration does a better job, you have it reduces so much the number of iterations you can do for a certain time budget that overall you are better using a naive method. So all the deep learning, there are always special cases, but for everything we will see here on virtually every method used in practice, deep learning relies on the smarter use of the gradient and use what was seen before, so in the previous steps. You are not making more computation, you are just using what you have seen before to get a better modeling, better to account better for the actual shape of the functional. So the two big families of methods, one is based on momentum and the other on moment estimation. So let's come back to the vanilla mini-batch stochastic gradient descent, the SGD. It consists of updating your parameters by subtracting an estimate of the gradient, where the estimate of the gradient is the sum of the gradient over a mini-batch. Okay? So now the first improvement is the use of a momentum. So instead of directly using the gradient, what you do is that you have a moving average of the gradient. So it's really ut equal gamma ut plus gamma ut minus 1 plus eta gt. So it has really the form of a moving average depending on the value of eta and gamma. And then this is this running estimate that you use to move your to update your parameters. So if we take gamma equals 0, this is the vanilla stochastic gradient descent because this term disappears. So your moving average is actually eta time gamma t, time gt, sorry, and you update with it. But if gamma is greater than 0, this update has three nice properties. So the first one is that it can go through local barriers, because what's going to happen is that if gamma equal, let's say 0.9, when you iterate next time, you indeed take into account the current gradient, but you also, depending with what is the trade-off between those two values, you also take into account the previous direction you are moving through. So it's really like inertia going down a slope. Even if at some point it goes up again a little bit, if you have taken enough speed, you would go through it. The second thing that it accelerates if the gradient does not change much. So for instance, if the gradient is constant, doesn't depend on t, you would end up, you would tend to this limit value, which is u equal eta over 1 minus gamma g, which again, the closer gamma is to 1, which means the more you have a memory and inertia in your estimate, the more you have a momentum, the more you would accelerate when the gradient does not change. And finally, if you oscillate, so if in one of the directions the gradient changes sign constantly, then this moving average would tend to neutralize this and to dampen the oscillations. So we can illustrate this. So remember, here I show the behavior that we saw before with a step size of 0.05 on our little problem. Here I show the vanilla stochastic, the vanilla descent, so there is no momentum. The momentum term is set to 0. We have the trajectory we saw before, so we oscillate along the y-axis and we move not fast enough in the x-axis. Now if I add a bit of momentum to what happens, we see that it dampens the oscillation in the y direction and accelerates in the x direction. And if we were making this stronger, it would be even better. So the second class of methods use statistics accumulated over the previous steps to compensate explicitly for this isotropy of the mapping, the fact that the gradient is far stronger in some direction than the other. So IAM is a canonical example of this class of methods, and it explicitly keeps moving averages for each coordinate of both the coordinate of the gradient, of the value of the gradient itself, and the square of the gradient. So in practice, MT is beta 1 of the previous value plus 1 minus beta 1, the current value of the gradient. This is on each coordinate separately. from MT, you can compute a running estimate of the average value of the gradient by dividing by the 1 minus beta 1. And you do the same for the square of the gradient. So you have the moving average for the gradient and the moving average for the square of the gradient. And now, instead of updating your parameters with the gradient itself, you use your moving average rescaled by the square root of your running average of the square, which means that if the gradient is far stronger in direction, it will be rescaled. If it's far smaller, it will be rescaled. You have three parameters: beta 1, which is how much memory you have for your running average of the gradient itself; beta 2, which is memory for the square of the gradient; and epsilon, which is a way of dealing with the gradient collapses, what you should do. If we take the standard example that we have seen before of the behavior of the vanilla stochastic gradient descent in an anisotropic quadratic form, we saw this. And now if I use Adam with the standard parameters, standard value for the parameters, what we see that indeed the gradient, by having this effect of compensating for the difference of amplitude of gradient in different directions, go far better in the proper direction, even though it doesn't use secondary derivative, which is there is a lot of beauty in having such a simple update rule, because here you simply keep, instead of computing one gradient, you just keep two running averages basically on top of computing the gradient itself. But it's very cheap. You just compute this from the gradient that you have anyway. You have something that quite compensates very well for the anisotropy. These two core strategies, so momentum and Adam, have multiple variations on the other method which predated or which have improvement. So Nesterov accelerated gradients, AdaGrad, AdaDelta, RMS prop, AdaMax, NADAM, etc., etc. So we won't look at all this in detail, because it's again in itself it could be a full course, full master's course. PyTorch offers implementations of those techniques in a package called Optim. So, in practice, we can first look at what the standard stochastic gradient descent will look like. So, in that case, what we do is that we are going to go 25 times through all the samples. Then we visit the samples by batch, mini batch of size, mini batch size. And for every one of those mini batch, what we do is that we narrow the input over this mini batch. So coordinate index 0, which is the sample number. We start at B, which is visiting the indexes, the numbers between 0 and the number of samples by steps of mini batch size. And we focus over a range of mini batch size. Then we compute the criterion, the loss between the output we got on the target, also narrowed over the same mini batch. Then we set the gradient of the parameters to 0. We do the backward pass to compute the gradient, the derivative of the loss with respect to each individual parameter. And then we do the update by, we loop through the parameters. So remember that model.parameters is an iterator over all the variables, the tensors of the parameters. And for each of them, we add to the actual tensor of the parameter minus the step size times the gradient, the tensor of the gradient of the parameter. So this is really like the Wt plus 1 equal Wt minus eta time gradient. Okay? And we can rewrite this with the Optim package as follows. Instead of doing it completely by hand with a loop, we first construct an optimizer, in that case the stochastic gradient descent. We have to give it as parameters, as arguments, the parameters of the iterator of the parameters model, so standard model.parameters. And we also have, for this one, to give it learning rate, so we set it to eta, which was the same as there. And now in the loop, everything is the same. We focus on a mini batch for the input, we focus on a mini batch for the target, we can set the gradient to 0, do the backward, but now, instead of doing this by hand, and implement the step of the stochastic gradient descent with a loop, we simply call the step method of the optimizer. Okay? On this, we do the loop over the parameters on the update, etc. Now, if you do it like this, it's very nice because it opens you to using all the variants around the SGD very easily. So an optimizer in practice, in the case of the SGD, does not have a state, but for some of them it does. So it has an internal state, for instance, to keep the moving averages, and it operates, as we saw, over an iterator over the parameters. The values specific to an optimizer can be passed to its constructors, such that the B1 and B2 and epsilon for Adam. And every time you do the step, that you call the step method, it will first update the internal state according to the attribute grade of the parameters it visits. So these things about Adam, it would first update the MT and VT, and then it will update the parameters themselves according to those, either directly to the gradient in the case of the vanilla stochastic gradient descent, or to other quantities which have been updated if it's a more sophisticated method. You have stochastic gradient descent, Adam, Ada delta, Ada grad, RMS prop, LFSGS, etc. There are some technical points. An optimizer can also operate on several iterators, each corresponding to a group of parameters that should be handled similarly. So, for instance, you may have different parameters corresponding to different layers in your model, for instance. But we will not see this in the course. I'm just stating this for completeness, but it's quite a sophisticated thing to do. So now if we come back to our simple example, if we just replace the line, the construction of the optimizer from optim_sgd model.parameters learning rate equal data, we replace it with this. So everything is the same except that instead of stochastic gradient descent now we use Adam. Everything remains the same and we are using Adam in our code. Be careful doing this that brutally because for some optimizers the learning rate may differ strongly. So sometimes you just have to change the code, change the constructor and everything follows. Sometimes it's different. So now we can put all this together because we have seen everything needed to define the network and everything needed to train it. So remember we have seen last time the different PyTorch modules for the different type of layers, fully connected, convolutional, pooling, and ReLU. And now we saw the cross-entropy loss for classification. We saw the backprop algorithm in the previous courses, and we have seen now the stochastic gradient descent. The only missing piece is how to initialize the parameters of the modules. We will come back to this, but the general rule is that PyTorch does a good job doing this. So by default, you can just keep the standard initialization. In some case, you may want to do some more fancy stuff, but it's quite unusual. Often you can just keep the default initialization. So we have already seen this. So first, the import from PyTorch. So we import CUDA, NN, and Optim. From NN, we import the functional as F for simplicity of notation. We also import variable, and for Torch Vision, we import datasets because we want to use minis. This we have already seen is the definition of the model itself. So we have the constructor, the init method that just define as a data field of the object the modules which have parameters that we are going to optimize. And then in the forward method, we just apply the functional, the autograd compliant method, such a function such as pooling and ReLU, and we just apply the first convolution layer, second, we reshape the data and send it through the first fully connected, second fully connected, and we get the response. Okay, so this was, we went through this in detail last time. Now the rest of the code. So first we load the data we use Torch Vision to get NIST. We reshape the input tensor in multi-sample, one-channel images that we make float, and we put this in a variable. Same for the labels, we put them into a variable. We define the model and the criterion. So the model is an association of our class, and the criterion is going to be the cross-entropy. We'll come back to this next time, but now if we see that we have a CUDA available, so if there is a GPU, we move the model to the GPU, we move the criterion to the GPU, we move the data, training data, both the input tensor and the target tensor to the GPU. So again, this we will see next time, but for the rest, it does not change anything. The code remains identical. Then we have to normalize the data, so we compute the mean values and standard deviation of the input tensor, and we subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation. Then we define the learning rate, how many times we are going to go through all the samples, and what is the mini batch size we are going to use. We define our optimizer as being SGD, with the learning rate we specifies on the model parameters as an iterator of the model parameters. And then we are going to loop through all the samples NB epochs times. And for each of this loop, we are going to visit all the samples by batch of batch size. As we did before, we narrow the input over this batch. We compute output. We compute the loss between this output and the labels. Now the target narrowed also on the same batch. Set the gradient to 0, do the backward pass, and optimize the network to one step of optimization. So all this is exactly how you should do. And you can see that it's quite nice because now we could easily change the optimizer. We could easily change the model in this piece of code. The model can be anything, it would work. We could easily change the dataset, etc. So here we see that indeed, by using a framework, and especially PyTorch, we can define everything in a few lines of code, and all those powerful methods are used without having to write a lot of complicated things. So now we move to a slightly different topic, which is using L2 and L1 penalties to regularize the training. So this is something which is quite popular for certain machine learning methods, and especially when you have small training sets, because it's a very simple way of reducing the capacity of a model. So if you remember, we motivated the use of a loss with a Bayesian formulation, either a maximum likelihood formulation or a Bayesian one, where we could express that what we want to do eventually is to maximize the probability of the parameters given the data. And thanks to Bayes' law, we can rewrite this as maximizing the probability of the data plus the log of the probability of the data plus the log of the probability of the parameters when we are given a prior distribution over the parameters. And in particular, if we use a Gaussian prior over the parameters, this term takes now the form of L2, the square of the L2 norm of the parameters, because the Gaussian distribution is exponential minus this quantity. So when you take the log, in the end, when you want to maximize this quantity, having such a prior amounts to adding to your loss that you want to minimize a penalty of that sort, which makes a lot of sense. You want your given, if your prior is that your parameters are close to 0, you just want to push your optimizer to go there. The lambda plays the role of the strength of this prior, and it's related to the standard deviation of your prior model. If the standard deviation is very small, it means you have a strong prior that your parameters have to be small, and you need a lot of evidences from the data to move away from it. From an optimization perspective, this is a convex term. So if you have a convex loss and you add such a term, you end up with a zero convex loss. This is called the L2 regularization or weight decay in the artificial neural network community. It's a very standard way of regularizing your training. So to get a bit a feeling of what's going on, we can consider a simple case where we want to minimize the loss, which is the red curve. And so this is this expression. And we are going to see what happens when we add more and more quadratic penalty. So it's clear that the more we will add, the more we will increase lambda, the more the red curve will get closer to a parabole, because if lambda was very, very large, the initial loss would be lost, the initial function would be lost in front of the penalty. And also, it's obvious that since the L2 penalty has a derivative which is 0 at 0, if functional has a non-zero slope at 0, so if the minimum of your original functional is not, there is no minimum at 0, you will never move the minimum there by increasing lambda, because whatever lambda is, this term will have a zero derivative at 0, which means that the optimal will always be slightly away from 0. But still, what we see that, so here I add x squared, 2x squared, 3x squared, 4x squared, and we see that, as expected, the function we want to minimize, it looks more and more like a parabole, and the optimal gets more and more closer to 0. So it's quite reasonable, it's exactly what we expect. By putting a quadratic penalty, we move the optimal towards 0. We can take a slightly more complicated example. So, as usual, a ConvNet random NIST, we train it with a small data set of 1000 samples, and we add the L2 penalty. So this is a way of implementing it. We keep the criterion we had before, which could be cross entropy. And now what we do is that when we compute the loss, instead of just computing the loss over the mini batch, we also add a penalty term, which is we visit all the parameter tensors of the model, and we add to our loss lambda time the sum of the square of the parameters, and then we do our back pass as usual, and we optimize our step as usual. And here what I show is that it's a cumulative distribution function of the weights of the network. So this is this CDF for lambda equals 0, so without L2 regularization we are discussing now. This is the CDF, so we see that it's the weights are centered at 0, half of them, the median is near 0, and we see that most of them are between -1 and -0.1 and +0.1. Now what I'm going to do is to increase lambda and to plot the CDF of the weights when we do the full training. And what we see that the more we increase lambda, the more the CDF gets concentrated around 0. So which makes sense again, it's exactly what we expect. When you put a prior that states that the weight should be close to 0, your optimization will tend to focus there. And we also see that here I show the training error and the test error for different values of lambda. And as expected, the greater lambda, the more regularization, the less capacity, so the training error increases. And at first, the test error decreases a very little bit, and then increases again. So we see a little bit the regularization effect of reducing capacity. So this is a quite standard regularization penalty, but we can apply exactly the same scheme with a different prior over the weight. So instead of taking a Gaussian prior, we can use a Laplace prior, which is very similar, but instead of being exponential minus the square of the L2 norm is exponential minus the L1 norm with a proportionally factor in front. So now if we make this more explicit, we see that it's the sum over the weights of their absolute value. And now this results in a penalty. If we see this as a prior distribution, we take the log, we end up optimizing the log of the probability of the parameters in a Bayesian formulation, end up being equivalent to adding L1 penalty to the loss. So we have the first, as usual, a loss like cross entropy or whatever you want to fit the data, and we now add this regularization, which is proportional to L1 norm of the weights, and now it's simply tend to penalize some of the absolute value of the parameters. As for the L2 penalty, this is convex, which means that if you had a loss which is convex and you add such a penalty, you end up with a convex loss to optimize. What is very interesting with the L1 penalty, what is probably the most important difference with L2, is that imagine we are minimizing this quantity, which is the loss plus this L1 penalty, and this is our optimum, W star. We have the following result, which is that if the slope of the original loss at W star was smaller than lambda, then for a certain coordinate, so if the derivative of the original loss at W star with respect to WD is smaller than lambda, so smaller than the weight which with you add the L1 penalty, then W star of D has to be 0, which makes sense. So if your slope was smaller than lambda, it means that it's going to be a local minimum for this quantity, because you will have a negative slope on the left of 0 and a positive slope on the right of 0. If you add something which has a slope smaller than lambda, you don't compensate for it, and your minimum for this coordinate remains at 0. We will illustrate this in the coming slides. So what is quite important is that it means that this penalty pushes some of the variables actually to 0. L2 push them slowly, never reach 0, but for L1 you actually go there. On the more you increase lambda, the more you are making your final solution sparse. You are really going to make some of the coefficients 0. So with the L1 penalty, the update rule becomes the usual. You optimize, you do your step according to the gradient, and then you have your step according. You have a term that depends on the derivative of the L1, which is the sign. Which is if you are on the positive side, you want to go towards 0. Your sign is positive, and because you are minus, you tend to reduce your parameter. And if you are on the negative side, you tend to go further. This is applied coordinate-wise, of course. You compute the sign per coordinate. We can rewrite this in an almost similar manner by doing this in 2 steps. We first move according to the gradient, and then we move according to the L1 penalty. It's not exactly the same because maybe the L1 you may have changed the sign doing this step, but still it's virtually the same thing. But what may happen now is that you may overshoot, which means that since you are moving by lambda either to the positive side or to the negative side, you are going to oscillate around 0. You will never be 0. So this may not be a problem. So in principle, we don't care because you are going to oscillate in a range which is smaller than lambda. If you are if you are crossing 0 by moving by lambda, it means you are less than lambda away from 0. So you are going to oscillate. But this can be a problem because in many applications you really want to have actual zeros, either to count stuff without thresholding or to maybe do some specific processing with the non-zeros, like maybe you want to use sparse coding or in memory or stuff like that. So to do this, there is another way of doing the second step of what I described, which is the proximal operator, which means basically for the second step, so for this step, instead of just taking the sign and moving according to it, you take the sign, and if you cross 0, you stay there. So you move according to the sign, you move according to this update, but for every coordinates, if one of them change sign, you just stay there, which can be rewritten like that. Again, this is done component-wise. You move at most by lambda, but if your absolute value of this coordinate was smaller than lambda, you move by this quantity. Okay. So it's maybe again, maybe you should take a piece of paper and a pencil to think about this, but it's simply that you go coordinate by coordinate. If they are greater in absolute value than lambda, you just move towards 0 by lambda. If they are smaller in absolute value than lambda, then you set them to 0. So now we can look at our synthetic example to get a feeling of what happens in practice. So same, I start with my same toy example to minimize without penalty. So it's the same as we saw for L2 when there was no penalty. And now if we add the penalty with only 1/2, we see that, of course, because this guy has an angle at the corner at 0, we see a little bit this fact that the slope changed brutally here, but still the minimum is there. We add a little bit more, we are there. And now what happens, it's what I said before, now that the slope is bigger, the slope of the L1 penalty is bigger than the slope we had here. Now we are negative on the left and positive on the right, which means that now the zeros, the optimal is truly there. It's truly at 0, and it stays there. If we increase the weight of the L1 penalty, the angle gets even stronger, and we stay there. The overall intuition is that the L1 penalty has a corner, so if you add it to something smooth, you will end up with corners at zeros, either no minimum or really the minimum is truly there, and you stay there and you don't move again. So now we can look at our example with a neural network. We train a ConvNet with 1000 examples, exactly the same experiment as before. And this is the CDF for the weight as before. And now what we see is that if I add the L1 penalty with 10 to the power to 10 minus 5, we see that it kills 0.5% of the weight. There's truly 0. Here there is a discontinuity in CDF of 0.05% of the weight are 0. If we increase the lambda, now it's 2.7. And we see that indeed we can really push So with lambda equal 5 to the 0.0005, we end up killing 90% of the weights, which are truly set to 0. That's quite cool to truly have real sparsity. You don't need to re-threshold after your optimization. And here we see, as before, that the train error increases and that the test error first decreases and then increases. So we have the same property of reducing capacity and controlling overfitting. So such penalties on the weights may be useful when you are dealing with small models and small data sets, and they are still quite standard when data is scarce, when you don't have large training sets. In practice, they don't have a strong impact for large-scale deep learning. So I don't think that if your goal is not just to beat the state of the art, if your goal is to have something working, they are not very, very important, but they may still provide a little push, especially for academic publications, to beat baseline. So sometimes you need this 0.5% or 1% on put. If everybody is using regularization on some application, it may help. So you may consider this. It's important to know it exists. So now we come to a very important topic regarding the training of deep networks, which is the notion of vanishing gradient. So if we come back to the formulas for the forward and backward pass, if you remember we had this, so the forward pass in a standard MLP would be, you have this S, which is pre-nonlinearity activations, which is just a linear, unaffine transformation of the activations, and then the post-nonlinearity, which is just a pointwise activation function applied to the previous. On the backward pass, we saw those expressions where when you go through the nonlinearity, you just multiply component-wise by the derivative of the nonlinearity. And when you go through a layer, you just multiply again by the weight matrix on the left, by the transpose of the weight matrix. And then to go to the parameters, to compute the derivative of the loss with respect to the parameters, for the weight, it's simply a matrix product. And for the bias, you just take it as is. So, to summarize, we have this quite important expression, which is that the derivative of the loss with respect to the activations in a layer can be written like this. You first take the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation of the next layer, you multiply pointwise by the derivative of the nonlinearity, and then you multiply by a matrix. So the gradient may vanish, may disappear, if either this guy is close to 0, so if for some reasons you are in the plateau, in the vanishing part of the nonlinearity of the activation function. So think about typically the hyperbolic tangent. As soon as you are far from 0 on one side, you're dead. Or if this guy is ill-conditioned or at least has small singular value. So if this guy has singular values which are close to 0 in absolute value, you may end up with all these being small. And indeed, what we observe is that this happens exponentially, because since you iterate, even if in each layer it's not too bad, even if no layer actually keeps your gradient, when you iterate this through the back pass, through the backward pass, it's likely that you will get that this guy will get smaller and smaller and smaller. Every time you visit one of these guys, you may you may reduce a bit your gradient. Every time you go through this guy, you may reduce a bit your gradient. It could also go the other way around. You could have an exploding gradient due to this, but it does not happen so much in practice. And if you look at this graph from a paper by Gloro and Bengio from 2010, what they did was to look at the distribution of the norm of the backpropagated gradient. As the actual backpropagated gradient through layers, and we see that the more you go into layers, the more the gradient is killed. So if you are in layer 1, it's highly concentrated around 0, layer 2 a bit less, etc. So it's exactly the vanishing effect we can get from this. The more you go back from the last layers to the initial ones, the more your gradient gets concentrated around 0, so it gets smaller and smaller. And this calls for a very careful weight initialization, because this is something highly undesirable. So it's what we are going to show in the coming slides. We are going to use expressions, approximations of those quantities, the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the weight and the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the bias. And we are going to try to control those quantities so that first the gradient does not vanish. It's what I showed in the previous slide, the fact that when you go back from the last layers to the first one, you may exponentially kill your gradient. And also another point which is quite important, and which was brought by Gloro and Benjo in their paper, is that what may happen also is not only that the gradient vanishes in the sense that you have nothing, you cannot optimize at all, so your parameters do not move, but also what may happen is that you have a completely different dynamic in layers. So some layers are going to have a very small gradient and move extremely slowly, are going to be updated extremely slowly, while others would reach very quickly an equilibrium. So in the end, you want to maintain the dynamic of all the layers to be similar. You want all the layers to go on training at the same speed. You don't want one to settle to reach saturation before the other, because then it means you do not have the ability to challenge what has been learned to be more consistent with what is learned in the other layers. So we are going to use this very standard result from probability theory, which is the variance of two independent variables is the product of the variance plus the product of the variance on the expectation square. So variance of AB, variance of A, variance of B plus variance of A, expectation of B square, variance of B, expectation of A square. And in the coming slides, it will happen that many quantities in the layer have the same variance or the same expectation, and in which case I will drop the index for simplicity. Okay. So in the standard layer, we have this expression, which is that post-nonlinearity activation is a nonlinearity applied component-wise to this affine expression, where NL is the number of units in the layer L and sigma is an activation function. And if we make the assumption that the activation function at 0 is the identity and that we are actually in this regime, we can forget the nonlinearity. And we get that the activation in the next layer is an affine transformation of the activation in the previous layer. So now we can look at the variance of the activation in the next layer. So if both the weights and the activations are centered, we get that the variance of the activation in the next layer is simply the product of the variance of the weight times the variance of the activations, which makes sense. I mean, if you just think in terms of rescaling, if all the weights were rescaled by a certain constant, you would get a square, this constant square in front, which you get, and similarly for the activation. And if the B are centered, so are the X's. So now if we sample the weights IID in each layer, and if the Xi all have the same variance for a certain layer, so again, if we sample the weights independently with the same distribution, and if the X's all have the same variance for in a certain layer, then what we get is that the variance of the activation in a layer is the number of units in the previous layer times the variance of the weight in the current layer times the variance of the activation from the previous layer. Again, it makes much sense, because given that an activation in a layer is the sum of independent quantities and our assumptions, a number of quantities as many as there are units in the previous layer, because each previous unit contributes, it makes sense that this shows up in front. So we get this very nice result for the variance of the activation, which is that the variance of the activation in layer L is the variance of the activation in the initial layer time through the layers, number of units in each layer, times the variance of the weight in each layer. Again, I think it's quite intuitive that the variance of the weights is directly impact directly the variance of the activations. What is quite natural when you think about it, but maybe needed this derivation, is that the number of units matters, because each activation is going to be the sum of activations coming from the previous layer. So the number of units of the previous layer matters. So now what we get is that if we want to control the variance of the activations themselves, we have to compensate in each layer the number of units through the variance of the weights. So it makes a lot of sense to initialize your weights. The take-home message is that now, instead of initialize your weights with the same random distribution, with the same distribution all over the network, you are going to rescale in each layer according to the number of units in this layer. The more there are units, the smaller should be the weights, which makes a lot of sense. And indeed, if we look in the PyTorch code and we look at reset parameter for the linear layer, so again, a disclaimer, maybe PyTorch has changed since I did this copy-paste, but this one is nice because at some point it was written like this and it makes a lot of sense. We see that they compute the standard deviation as being 1 over the number of input units, and then they sample, they sample both the weights and the bias according to a uniform distribution in this range. And by the way, there is a mistake because the standard deviation of the uniform distribution between minus delta delta is not delta, it's square root 3 of delta. So they are missing a square root 3, but I guess now it's quite hard to fix this because probably there are zillions of lines of code that depend on the very behavior of this guy. Okay, so bottom line, this is the first initialization rule that we saw, that we can use, and it's a very standard one. It's the standard one in PyTorch. You just rescale your weights, you sample your weight with the standard deviation, which is 1 over the square root of the number of units in your layer. Or the variance is 1 over the number of units in the layer to compensate for the number of terms you sum when you compute an activation. So now we can look at the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activations. So from the expression of what we got in the backward pass, we have that the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation in a certain layer can be rewritten like that. So it's a sum through the units in the next layer of the derivative of the loss with respect to those activations time the derivative of those activation with respect to the one we're interested in, which in the end gives us this quantity, this expression, which is the sum over the units in the next layer of the weight between them time the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation of the next layer, from which we get this expression. So the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation in layer L is well approximated by the number of units in the next layer times the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation of the next layer times the variance of the weight in the layer in the said layer. Which means that if we take the product over all the layers, we get that the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation in a certain layer is, again, because we make the assumption we are in the identity part of the nonlinearity, the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the final activation, the one at the end of the network, times the product through all the layers between the one we are interested in on the output of the network, of the number of units times the variance of the weights in this layer. So it's very similar to what we saw for the variance of the derivative of the loss of the activations themselves, except that instead of taking the product between the input and the layer, now we take the product between the layer and the output. Now we want to look at the derivative of the loss with respect to the weight, which is basically what we are truly interested in. If we take again the expression of the activation in the layer as a function of the activation in the previous one, we get that the derivative of the loss with respect to the weight is, we already saw this, the product of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation in the next layer times the activation in the previous, in the one that enters this layer. And then, so the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the weight is a product of the variance of the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation in the coming out of this layer times the variance of the activation of the incoming activation. Now, if we replace those two expressions by what we got in the previous slides, we get finally this expression, which is a bit problematic in some way, because it shows that you cannot control individually the layer. So you have this term, which is the product of the number of units and the variance of the weights through all the layers. So it's not specific to L. On the quantity which are specific to small l, so the layer we are interested in at that point, is not controllable. It's the number of units, so we cannot control this by playing with the variance of the weights. Now we can look at the derivative of the loss with respect to the bias. This one is the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation, which means that the variance is the same, and we can control this. So in the end, to control the variance of the activations, we can do something. We want the variance of the weight to be 1 over the number of units in the layer. And to control the variance of the gradient with respect to the bias, we have to control the variance of the gradient with respect to the activations. And we would like to have the variance of the weights being in 1 over the number of units in the output of this layer. So this is a number of units that incoming to the layer of the weight, and this is the number of units that goes out of the layer. Which means that we can't have both at the same time, but we can find a compromise, which is the Xavier initialization, where you take for variance for the weight something proportional to 1 over the average between the number of units incoming the layer where the weight is and the number of units in the layer where the weight is. This is called the Xavier initialization. It was proposed in 2010. Now, if we look in the code in the init.py of PyTorch, we have a function that does precisely this, and it will precisely that is the standard deviation is a gain, and we'll come back to this, time the square root of 2 divided by the total number of units, which is exactly the sum of the units, which is exactly what we saw in the previous slide. Now, in the same paper, what was shown is that indeed, if you use a standard initialization where you don't take into account the number of units, you get this kind of behavior. We saw this previously. And now with the proper initialization, the distribution of all the gradients is similar in all the layers. They are well aligned. So it's exactly what we want. We're happy with this. So now what we can look at is how to rescale the weight to deal with, to compensate for the activation functions, because what we have done so far is to make the assumption that we were in the identity part of the activation function. Remember that we have this. So more precisely, we have that. The variance of the product of 2 independent random variables is a variance of the first time expectation of the square of the second plus the variance of the second time expectation of the first square. So I just rewrite a little bit what is there. And now what we get is that, remember that for the forward pass, we have this. So SIL equal an affine transformation of sigma of SG L minus 1. So the pre-nonlinearity activations are a linear function, an affine transformation of the post-nonlinearity activation. And if the weights are centered on the activation prior to the nonlinearity is symmetric, and if we consider ReLU, which is a very standard nonlinearity, what we do get is from this expression directly that, so the variance of the activations pre-nonlinearity is simply the number of units times the variance of the weight times the sigma, the pre-nonlinearity activation. We directly transcript this expression in terms of variance. And this is where we use expression of the previous slide. So the variance of this is the variance of that time expectation of the square of this. The second term disappears because we say that this guy is centered, so the expectation of this thing is 0, so the square of the expectation of this thing is 0. And this is where the magic happens between those two lines. Given that S is symmetric, and that this is ReLU, the expectation of ReLU of something square will be the same as 1/2 expectation of square, because you are just killing half of the time. So we could split this into expectation given that it's negative, time probability to be negative, plus expectation given that it's positive, time probability to be positive, and then the ReLU would kill the first, and we will end up with the second, which is equal to the first, and which is 1/2. So now the 1/2 go in front, and we get something which is kind of reasonable, which is that the variance of the activation after the linear transformation is 1/2 of what we would have without ReLU. So simply the number of unit time variance of the weight time variance of the activation. Similarly, for the backward pass, we have this expression. Now the variance of the derivative of ReLU is 0 or 1, and again it will be with probability 0, with probability 1/2 it will be 0, with probability 1/2 it will be 1, because we made the assumption that this quantity was centered. This is symmetric on the expectation 0, so now we can rewrite this like that. We use the trick of the initial slide, so the second term plus disappear, and now we get this final result, which is kind of reasonable. It's 1/2, again it's very similar, of the sum over the unit of the variance of the loss with respect to the activation times the variance of the weight. So all in all, what we get is this 1/2 factor in front of the quantity, which means that we can compensate for it. We can compensate for the use of ReLU by multiplying all the weights by a square root of 2, so that their variance is multiplied by 2 and compensate this factor 1/2 we have seen everywhere. So if we look at in init.py, we see that indeed there's different cases. So in the case of the sigmoid or the linear layers, the gain would be 1 because there is nothing to compensate for, because we make the assumption we are in the identity part of the sigmoid. If it's hyperbolic tangent, there is a certain gain that we have not explained, but which follows the same kind of derivation. And for ReLU, indeed, we have the gain is square root of 2 to compensate for the 1/2. The overall, the point, the assumption that we are in the identity part of the sigmoid seems a bit unreasonable, but actually it is, because we control the variance precisely to remain in this regime. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. As long as we control the variance, our assumption on how to control the variance is reasonable, and we do indeed control the variance. So all those derivations were done with under the assumption that the variance of the input to the network was itself controlled, which means that we have to control the variance of the data themselves, of the data itself. So we have the first way is simply to make the assumption that we are going to normalize all the components of the input the same way. So we just compute the mean across the complete tensor and the standard deviation across the complete tensor and subtract this mean and this standard deviation. But we can also do it component-wise by computing the mean and the variance along the sample index, from which we will get a tensor which has one less dimension. So mu will have it will be the same shape as train input, except the first dimension will be lost. And thanks to broadcasting, when you subtract mu to train input, broadcasting will add a 1 as the first dimension, and then replicate this tensor as many times as it needed to do the operation properly. Same for the component-wise division. Okay, so now we reach quite a central practical problem for which unfortunately there is no definite answer, which is how do you pick the network structure? So it's quite a difficult exercise. It's a question that comes again and again, because of course everybody would like to know the magic recipe to do this, but there is no silver bullet. So you have to have expertise, and you have to just practice a lot to get a feeling of what works and what does not work in certain situations. So still we can list a few very common sense rules. So the first one is to reuse something well known that works. So if you are dealing with a problem that looks like something that has already been solved by other people, you look at the literature, all the repository of models, all the blog posts around the same topics, and you start from something that seems to be similar, a model that works on a problem that seems similar to yours. Either you use it as is, or you start from there and you try to improve. The second thing that you may have an idea about a part of your network should do feature extraction, another part should do the inference itself, which may guide you in the design. You should start with convolution layers and then after a while go into inference. This is disputable because the very notion that a part of the network does the feature extraction, the other part does inference is something we'll come back to because it's not so clear. A very central point that for sure is to modulate the capacity of your model. So overall, if both your train and test error are bad, you can do something, because you can always increase your capacity so much that you will reduce the training error. So if you're, except in some very, very weird cases where you have such a huge data set that nothing happens, or it's so expensive computationally that you can't do anything. But overall, in a very reasonable setup, if you have both a very high train and test error, you are doing something wrong. So you can, to limit the cost of your experiment, what you can do is to extract a small subset, and at least find an architecture that overfits on this subset. So which means you can make basically your training error as small as you want. When you start to have a gap between the train and the test error, now the real problem appears. But until it's the case, you have to increase your capacity. You must see that your model is learning something in training. The real issue where really there are problems is how do you deal with overfitting, not how do you overfit. You can control the capacity by increasing the number of layers, increasing the number of channels or filters, increasing the filter size, or increasing overall the number of units in a fully connected layer. And you can reduce the capacity by adding regularization on penalty terms to induce sparsity, or simply control them with weight decay. You may use prior knowledge about some different part of your input signal that should be processed in the same way, in which case you should have Siamese architecture, where you know that several components have to follow the same processing. That may help you design your model. You may also identify in a complex networks some paths that need more or less capacity. So for instance, if you know you are processing a pair of an image and a thermal sensor, you need probably less capacity for the part of the network that deal with the thermal sensor than the one dealing with the image. You may use a prior knowledge about what I would call the scale of the meaningful context. So if you are processing sound, let's say to do keyword spotting, and you know that a keyword is going to be 1 second or less, you know that in your convolutional processing, the final decision should have access to such a context of 1 second. Same for an image. If you know that your objects are of certain size, you must design the size of the filters and the number of convolution layers so that you have captured enough information, enough context to make your decision. And finally, unfortunately, you have to do grid search. So you have to have a bunch of GPUs and some time to just try variations, because many of the meta parameters, especially number of layers, number of filters, it's quite blind. So you start with something that works and say, okay, I'm going to have 20% more channels. Does it improve? If it improves, then you add even more. If it still improves, you will have even more. So you have in some way to do some kind of meta gradient search or meta genetic algorithm by yourself and running a bunch of experiments. We will come back to this list later when we will have seen more sophisticated regularization methods and the normalization methods. Now to come back to the learning rate, because this is also quite an important meta parameter, we want at first to reduce the loss quickly. So because you start with a network completely random, you would like initially to have a large learning rate to quickly converge to something which is not completely crazy. And you also want to evade bad local minimum. So if you are for some reason trapped very early in a local minimum, that's not good. So you know you should have a large learning rate to evade this. Now at some point you want to go down into the good valleys, into the good local minimum. So which means you need a small learning rate, because we saw this effect of gradient descent that if the learning rate is too large, we bounce around. And similarly, you don't want to oscillate around the minimum, which is related to bouncing around the valley. You don't want to turn around the local minimum forever, so you want a small learning rate. This overall calls for a strategy where you have a large learning rate at first and a small later. And the practical strategy is to get a feeling of what are the proper learning rate on the validation set, and then to design a scheduling strategy, how you should decrease your loss. There are basically two ways. Either you really decide that after a certain number of epochs, you set your loss to whatever, or you may have some more sophisticated strategies where you have, for instance, a geometric decay, which means that every epoch you reduce your learning rate by 1% or something like that. So we can make this a bit more concrete on an example. So here I'm training a convolution network on CFAR, and I'm plotting as a function of the number of epochs, both the training loss on this graph and the test accuracy. And we see that it's nice. The learning, so this is with stochastic gradient descent, batch size 100, cross entropy, the learning rate is 0.1. And we see that the loss goes down quite regularly. And the accuracy saturates very quickly after like 10 epochs. I'm at my best score, which is slightly below 70%. Okay, 70% of the labels are predicted correctly. What I can do is to look at different learning rates. So if I have a smaller learning rate, we go down slower, but it's far smoother because we really progress regularly. With a more aggressive learning rate of 0.1, we go a bit faster, but we see some irregularity. And if we are even more aggressive, so with twice this learning rate, we see that we go as fast initially, but then we saturate. We don't reach a correct final loss after 50 epochs. What we can do is to take this one that works really well and decide to change the learning rate after 25 epochs. And here I show what happens if we have we take a very small learning rate, so we divide our learning rate by 5. We see that then it goes even faster because we are probably now entering some valleys, but not that fast. If I divide the learning rate by, so here I divide the learning rate by 5, here I divide it only by 2. We see that it's even better because we are still quite fast. And here it's just an example, just to show how stable it is. This is 0.05 and this is 0.06, and this was 0.1. We see that just this slight difference make a lot of changes because here basically do not go on reducing the loss. Now we can keep this very good scheduling, and we see that indeed the loss goes down very well. This is a log scale, so this is quite impressive. And we see that indeed the accuracy jump to 72%. So we are quite happy with this. There is really a gain. So you can see that really dealing properly with the learning rate really makes a large difference. We can also look at the test loss, and in that case, the test loss is a very poor indicator of the accuracy because the accuracy, the higher is better, but the test loss, the higher is worse. And we see that very quickly the test loss starts to increase. So why is it possible? So that may look very counterintuitive that the accuracy improves while the test accuracy improves while the test loss degrades. It's probably because even though we are fixing some mislabeling on some sample, on other samples we get even more confident of the wrong answer. And as we saw, the cross entropy can go to plus infinity. So we are fixing some labeling, but we are degrading the loss by being even getting more confident over a subpopulation where we are already wrong. And we are getting wronger and wronger in some sense, and the cross entropy explodes. So to get a feeling of this overfitting behavior, what we can look at is, so this quantity is computed over each sample, and it's minus the log of the post softmax activation. So it's basically an estimate of the probability of the correct class. So this is the correct class. So on every sample we are going to sum, we are going to compute minus the log of our estimated probability of the correct class, I insist. So we would like this to be as small as possible, because when it's small it means this is getting close to 1. So when we look at the cumulative distribution functions over the samples, we get a curve like that, which means this is the probability that this proportion of this is the probability that samples will be greater than have this score smaller than this quantity. So all the samples have a score smaller than something like 10, but the ideal curve would be in the top left corner, which would mean that for all the samples, it's a log scale, so it would go to the left even more, but the higher the curve in the corner would mean that we are responding a probability 1 over the correct class for everybody. Okay? And if we go through the epochs, we can look at those two distributions over the training and the test examples, and we see that indeed we are pushing the CDF at the top left, so that's good. But we also see that there is an increasing discrepancy between the CDF estimated over the training examples and the CDF estimated over the test example. And this explains why you at some point you start to overfit. You are indeed not reflecting properly in the test what happens in train. Okay, so the last part of today's lecture is a bit more technical. It's how to write autograd function in PyTorch. So this is maybe not necessary if you may be completely plenty happy with using the existing modules and the existing autograd functions. But it may be interesting in some cases that you want to write some modules that need their own autograd function. So you have to go one step further. So basically, to write an autograd component function, you have to write a piece of code that will implement both the forward pass and the backward pass. So the forward pass will take as argument a context to store information needed for the backward and the quantities it should process. So basically, the forward will get a bunch of tensors and will compute a bunch of tensors. Tensors, not variable, I insist. They may also get other arguments, other parameters that you will not be computing the derivative with respect to. And the thing is that it's implemented with static methods. So an autograd function will not be an object, it will be a bunch of static functions acting over their parameters on the context where you can store things for the backward. And the backward pass will take a context where you may have stored quantities in the forward, and it will get as argument as many variables as forward was computing the result tensors, and it has to produce as many variables as forward was getting input tensors. For the argument for which you don't compute derivatives, you just have to reply none. So now, when you want to use such a function in practice over parameters, you have to call the apply method, which is the apply method of the superclass of the class autograd.function, which will do a bunch of stuff and then call your forward. So what is a bunch of stuff? The bunch of stuff is the construction of the graph to compute the derivatives that autograd does in the background. So in practice, if you create a new function named dummy, when you call dummy.apply, which is truly what you want to call when you want to use this on a bunch of variables, what's going to happen is that first autograd will add a node in its graph, and then it will call your dummy.forward and do the computation. And if you call, for instance, dummy.backward, if you want to compute the gradient, autograd will go through the graph, and at some point it will call dummy.backward, actually when it reaches this node. And this method, this static method, will be called with the context that was given to forward. So in practice, what does it mean? So first, this machinery is hidden to you. So here, maybe I'm giving a bit too much detail, but I think it's interesting to know this because it helps to write the functional. So in practice, you may not even need this. If you just trust the documentation, you have to write those two static functions that get this as argument and should return that. But in my opinion, to understand clearly the semantic of what you get and what you should return, it's interesting to know that it works like that. So now an example, I'm writing an autograd component function that gets a 2D tensor and is going to kill the n first columns, set them to 0. So this is what it looks like. Kill head inherits from torch.autograd.function. I have to implement those two static methods. So those are methods for the class, not for instantiation of the class. The forward get a context. So this is really an object used only to store values that you will need in the backward. It will get an input tensor, and it will get how many, an integer, which is the number of columns to kill. I will keep track of this because I need it in the backward. Then I clone the tensor because I don't want to do in-place modification. I kill I set to 0 the number of columns which are given as argument, so n of them. And then I return this tensor. And for the backward, I get the same context. So this guy, I will be able to access this because it will be there. And I get one variable. So this was a tensor. This is a variable, which is the gradient of the thing with respect to my output. In which case, now I will clone this variable, set to 0 the same columns, because of course, if they have been set to 0, my derivative with respect to them has to be 0. And then I return two quantities, one which is the gradient with respect to this guy, and the other one which is none because I'm not computing derivatives with respect to this integer. The convention is to create an alias, a lowercase killhead in that case of killhead.apply, and this will be usable as a function operating over variables. So now in practice, here I define a tensor, a 2D tensor, three row vectors of dimension 8, filled with a Gaussian noise. I create another one, so this will be my target. I'm going to do a bit of gradient descent, so this will be my target. This is my input. Here I define my criterion is a mean square error, and my learning rate is 1. And then for 10 times, I'm computing the image of f through my function killhead. Then I compute my criterion, and do my backward, and do my gradient step, and it works. I see the going down. Okay. So it's really that simple. You just have to write forward and backward, and everything works. PyTorch provides a quite useful tool to check the backward operation, to check the computation of the gradient, and it simply compares what your backward method computes with a numerical estimate of the derivative. So basically, this torch.autograd.gradcheck is going to go through all the inputs and all the outputs and check that when you compute the numerical derivative, so the function at x plus epsilon minus the function at x minus epsilon divided by 2 epsilon, you are not too far off from what your routine has computed. So in practice, how do you use this? You have to import from torch.autograd the method gradcheck. Then you define the input provides your function, so which is composed of a bunch of tensors and additional arguments. So in our case, for our killhead operation, this is a number of columns to set to 0, so we pick 4. You have to initialize your tensor to a certain value and to state that you require the gradient. Then what gradcheck is going to do is going to go through the components of the tensors and compute numerically this value and compare it to this, and if it always remains under the threshold, everything works well, otherwise you will get an error. So it's quite a standard sanity check, for which it's good to use double precision tensors, because this is better if you use double precision. So this test makes even more sense when you use double precision, and since this is not, you are going to do this once for debugging reasons, the computational cost is not such an issue. So now a last example to illustrate in more detail how you can save stuff in the context. So imagine that you want to write a function that gets two similar size variables and compute component-wise the absolute value of the product for the two arguments. The backward pass is to compute two tensors, and the forward must keep track of the input to compute the derivative in the backward. So you have to keep track of u and v. So this is how you would write such a function. Again, it's inherited from function, and you have to implement the two static methods forward and backward. You get the context, your two input tensors, again, those are not variables. And you can use context that save for backward the two tensors, and then we return the value of the forward, so actually this operation. And in the backward, we get back what we save in the forward, save variables, and then we compute the derivative. So it's simply, for you, the derivative will be the sign of v, and the same the other way around. The strange thing that you have to be aware of is that even though you pass tensors to save for backward, what you get from save variables are variables. Okay, so that's all for today. As for the other courses, this is the last time we have a practical. Next time it will be the mini projects. And as always, I'm plenty happy to get questions by mail, so do not hesitate if you have any comment on how to make this clearer, or if there are some points that need to be explained more precisely. Thanks a lot. Bye.